Hello and welcome back to Miss Hannah Loves Grammar. In this video, we're going to be concentrating on the Bloody Chamber, its context, its themes, and its literary methods. But today, I'd like for you to give an extra special thumbs up and like, because a great colleague of mine, the brilliant Miss Boyd, is collaborating for the first time ever on this channel with her analysis of the context, themes, and literary methods. If you haven't already, why not subscribe and join my tribe for all things English literary and grammatical. Over to you, Miss Brilliant Boyd.
So we know the Bloody Chamber, obviously this shares its title with the title of the anthology itself. It's significantly the longest. We definitely cannot discuss this anthology without discussing this story. But it's really important that you remember for your NEA, you absolutely cannot discuss only one short story. You need to show a knowledge of the breadth of this collection. I'm going to talk you through in this video and in upcoming videos some comparisons that you might choose to make. Before we do though, we're going to summarise the plot and we're going to look at 3 areas of context. This really does have quite a simple plot. A young naive girl agrees to marry a wealthy man. They move to his isolated castle together where she discovers the mutilated bodies of his previous wives. This is where we get the name, the Bloody Chamber. He obviously finds out about her discovery. He vows to kill her in a sacrificial, ritualized way. But before she herself is killed by her husband, her mother arrives to rescue her. Now, the first bit of context that we're going to look at is going to be genre related. This might sound familiar to you. If it does, that is because this is taken from a 17th century folktale by Charles Perrault called Bluebeard, which is still quite popular to this day. The book that Carter had published previous to the Bloody Chamber was actually a translation of Perrault's fairy tales from the French to English. So we know as she was writing this, she would have had his stories and all her fairy tale research really at the top of her head. So this original tale is often interpreted as a cautionary tale against female curiosity. The woman is as much to blame as the man. Carter is obviously moving away from that moral, and she also makes some other crucial changes. For example, in the original story, the young wife is rescued from her husband by her brothers. She is rescued from one patriarchal structure into another. Crucially, it is the mother who rescues the daughter in Carter's version. The original version is also written in the first-person narrative voice. Is written in the third-person narrative voice. This would be traditional for fairy tales. Carter, however, has moved this into first person, and we will talk more about this later. The second bit of context that we're going to talk about is also genre related, and that's talking about the Gothic. Now, if you have chosen the yellow wallpaper, Rebecca, or Haunting on House Hill, there are going to be some fabulous comparison points here for you. Nevertheless, make sure you are paying attention because this Gothic genre and these conventions are really important to our understanding of this text. So Carter employs lots of conventions that we see in the Gothic. We have a very luxurious but sinister and isolated castle. The servants themselves are quite ghostly and ominous. They seem to carry out many of the kind of evil wishes of their owner. Darkness permeates throughout. We've got a tortured male protagonist and, of course, the damsel in distress. Now, the importance of the Gothic setting, when taken in conjunction with the fairy tale, is that it allows Carter to explore really quite deep psychological states. The darkness of this tale reflects a lot of the darkness that we see in human sexuality or desire, and also the darkness that the protagonist experiences in her intense fear under the male gaze and male power. And the final bit of context, we're now going to move to our socio-historical context, which is this idea of second wave feminism. So feminism has changed throughout history. Different movements of feminism aim to achieve different things. The Bloody Chamber was published in 1979. This was a time of very intense feminist activity known as second wave feminism. First wave feminism happened much earlier. Think about the suffragettes for this. First wave feminism was mostly about looking at those legal obstacles to equality. So you'll think about women being able to own their own property, women being able to vote. Second wave feminism is much broader and it looks not only at some remaining legal obstacles, but also at some of the attitudinal and societal beliefs that get in the way of women achieving equality. For example, attitudes about sexuality, reproductive rights, family, the workplace. Carter herself was an active feminist, and she is definitely bringing in those feminist ideas to her stories. Now, we cannot discuss themes without recourse to literary methods, so the bulk of what I'm actually going to talk to you about in this presentation today is going to be those methods. Think of this as an introduction to help you place those within Carter's themes and messages. I'm going to talk about three main themes. The first one is this idea of the intersections, or you can think of that as the connections between violence and sexuality. The desire of the husband comes from the pleasure that he gets in seeing others, particularly women and particularly vulnerable women, in pain. When we have these descriptions of the husband, the very sumptuous castle, the bloody chamber, and of course that pornographic artwork that the wife finds in the husband, this clearly aligns the husband with a historical figure known as the Marquis de Sade. The Marquis de Sade was an 18th century French nobleman. He was infamous for many reasons. One of them was his large collection of pornography. Another was his libertine sexuality. He took a lot of sexual pleasure from the administering of pain. And it's from the Marquis de Sade that we get the word sadism. Another key theme is again this connection between gender and power, and this is where the change that Carter made from the original narrative becomes really important, because we see our female protagonist move from a position of naivety, she really seems more like a schoolgirl at the beginning of this, and powerlessness, to power and freedom. And you can see this in the narrative form itself. She is our first person narrator. She is reclaiming her own story. She is no longer just a fairy tale character. And the final one we're going to talk about is mother-daughter relationships. Again, we see that really crucial change from Perrault's narrative. It would be interesting here to actually look up in your own time some of Carter's biography. She had an incredibly tense, intensely close relationship with her mother. Her mother kind of dressed her and controlled a lot of things about her life up until she was a teenager. But towards the end of Carter's life, her mother was estranged from her really and refused to speak to her because Carter had had a divorce. One of the most important literary methods we need to talk about is symbolism. These stories are so rich in their symbolism, in the narrative inventiveness that Carter has shown, that to do word level analysis just isn't going to cut it. Instead, I'm going to talk you through 4 different methods you can use. I'm going to go quite quickly through a list of different symbols. Please, as you're watching this, pause the video, go and find these references, add to your annotations with your ideas and any other connotations that you can think of. The first symbol I'm going to talk about is the sea. She describes in the beginning the evanescent departures of the ocean. So she's describing there how it's almost as if the ocean has trapped her on this island. It travels from so far into the horizon, it seems impossible to escape. And when the sea has changed key, what the music master means here is that the change of the tide has allowed the husband to return home to enact his violent murder on the wife. It's almost as if the sea is complicit in the violence of this story. Another really important symbol, which also links to the genre, is this idea of the Gothic castle. So it is quite explicitly described as the fairy castle, linking it to that fairy tale genre. But we also have these servants who are just as important as the castle itself, with the exception of the music teacher, who is really a bit of an outsider in the servants. They are quite sinister. They are definitely working against the protagonist and helping in her oppression. There's a really fabulous comparison to be made here with Mrs. Danvers from Rebecca or the servant from The Haunting on House Hill. Of course, we also have to talk about the symbolism of that very sinister wedding gift, the ruby choker. So the protagonist describes it as being like a precious slit throat, clearly linking symbolically her marriage with her death. This is also the area that he's going to try and decapitate her from. And I wonder as well if we could also argue that this is meant to be a sexual image. Is this meant to recall the idea of a vulva and mark her out as his sexual object and sexual prey? On the subject of prey, that brings us to these really animalistic, beastly depictions of the husband. This story is absolutely peppered with this animalistic imagery. I've only given you 2 references there, but there are a lot more that you can find. With these animalistic references, is Carter trying to suggest that this character is a straightforward villain? Is she trying to suggest that all men have something beastly, especially when it comes to their sexual desires? Is she suggesting that our current understanding of heterosexual sexuality really places women as prey? Because we do have a clear imbalance of power between the protagonist and the husband. The protagonist is really seen as naive. She feels like more of a schoolgirl at the beginning, and if you read the descriptions of her clothing on page 8, it's very clear the husband wants to dress her up almost like a doll. There is a terrible imbalance of power. He is incredibly wealthy. She is coming from poverty. He is much older than her and is very sexually experienced. She is the young ingenue. He is in his home with his wealth, with his servants, with, as we know, his bloody chamber. She has been really quite abruptly removed from everything she's known since childhood. Flowers are very symbolically important in this story, and you'll also notice flowers coming up as symbols in some of the cat stories that follow with the depiction of the white roses. In this case, the flower is lilies. Now, lilies are commonly associated with death and with funerals, but the colour white is of course traditionally associated with purity. This brings us to perhaps the connection that it is her virginity and patriarchy's kind of intense, almost hypersexualization of virginity as a state that leaves her vulnerable to the deadly desires of her husband. The bloody chamber is an essential symbol of perhaps what could be the hidden dark side of human sexuality that gets pleasure from a feeling of power and from inflicting pain on others. It's also quite obvious when you read the husband's depiction on page 18, he wants her to go there. He gives her the key, he points it out, he gives her the directions how to go there. He wants her to find the bloody chamber, so he has an excuse to kill her. And finally, we're going to talk about the symbolism of music. So there's a couple of references throughout this story to Saint Cecilia. She is the patron saint of music. We see that the protagonist is a creative character, just like Carter is creative as a writer. The protagonist, however, is a musician, and she will of course go on to found her academy at the end. But at the beginning, she has given up her musical life to join in marriage. She's given up that part of her identity to become a wife. And the piece of music that is named is the Liebestod from Tristan and Isolde by Wagner, which if you've not listened to, I really recommend. It is a very powerful, dramatic piece of music, and listening to it really does capture the tone of this story. Liebestod is a convention in German opera, and those are songs that connect love and death. So just like the lilies, just like the choker, marriage for this woman is intrinsically connected with death. Now, the next method that we're going to talk about is something called intertextuality. I don't know about you, but when I was reading this text, I was constantly having to stop and look up names and look up references and check, is this the name of a real artist? So that's intertextuality. Intertextuality is the relationship between different texts. So when in this story Carter is referring to another text, whether that is a religious figure or whether that is a painting or whether that is a song, that is intertextuality. It happens really to some degree in all texts. However, in this one, it happens so frequently, it's obvious this is an important method in and of itself. So with this intertextuality, one of the best bits of advice that I can give you is that when you are reading up this text, look up all the different references that you don't know. I'm going to talk you through a really small selection of them. It's up to you to go away and find out the others. So it's full of references to, amongst other things, music, art, culture, religion, and history. In terms of art and culture, obviously there's a reference to Romeo and Juliet on page 7 in The Cigar. We know that's another story making connections between love and death. That pornographic painting that is described on page 13 is real. It's called Reproof of Curiosity. And there's also another list of great artists on page 17. As mentioned, for religion, we've already talked about Saint Cecilia, the patron saint of music. On page 26, when she's in the chamber, she describes the reek as sacerdotal. That means relating to priests. That's one example of our religious language. On page 37, when he's about to try and kill the bride, he's described as an auto de fe. That's another religious term. An auto de fe is the murder of a heretic. That's an example of some of the references that are there. But the big question is, why is Carter using so many references? It is not just to show off how intelligent and how well read she is. By using lots of references from the real world, and you can go and you can look up pictures of that painting, you can look up pictures of the other art pieces of art, you can look up the music, you can listen to it. That places this story about violent sexual desire and oppression in the real world. Fairy tales don't make reference to things in the real world, but this does. It's not possible for us anymore to only see this as a fairy tale. It's not possible for us anymore to ignore the prevalence of this violence and the gender and the wealth-based oppression in the real world, which this story is referencing. And another important thing about these references is that they span hundreds and hundreds of years. This is a long-standing history of patriarchy, of oppression, of the obsession with virginity, and of the obsession with male sexual power. Another method that I'm going to talk about just now is this idea of narrative, perspective, and voice. When it comes to structuring your NEA and you're thinking about what you can compare between texts, it's really helpful to compare like for like. A narrative perspective is a really good point of comparison. So this is written in the first person, past tense narrative. This is an important change from fairy tales. As Miss Clark mentioned in her earlier YouTube video, fairy tales don't have grey areas. They are just sharing these quite straightforward moral messages. And the third person works best for that matter of fact. But this is written in the first. So she often describes herself in the story as quite young and naive. There's some quotations there for you to look at. That's the girl in the story, however. The woman who's telling the story, the narrative voice itself often seems very confident, very worldly in its tone. And for example, she doesn't actually really shy away from criticising the husband. For example, she compares him to a gourmand. A gourmand is somebody who's very greedy, who's very gluttonous. Now, another thing about this first person past tense narrative voice is it tells us she survives. Our narrative impetus then doesn't come from thinking, oh, is she going to survive? Will she get out of this alive? It comes from us waiting to see how she defeated him. And perhaps the most important thing about this is it allows her to reclaim her own story. She is the teller of the tale. She has a distinctive voice. As moral stories, fairy tales are recounted in third person. Characters are seen as types or what are known as stock characters rather than individuals. But she is allowed the identity of an individual. The final method I'm going to talk to you about, and again, this is another great way to structure your comparisons in your NEA, is this idea of an ambiguous ending. So the very final lines of this are, "It spares my shame." And when I read this causes lots of different questions for me. What is her shame? Could it be her knowledge of male cruelty? Is it her knowledge of what hides behind sexual desire? Is it her knowledge of those deep and dark areas of ourselves that are hidden away in those bloody chambers and that aren't out on display? Is it that she has had sexual experiences with a man other than her final husband ended up? Is it the fact that her main motivation for marrying her husband perhaps was his wealth and the draw of the glamour? It's up to you to read that ending again and try and decide what that shame is. For me personally, it almost feels a bit frustrating. I feel like this mention of shame seems to put her in the place of a wrongdoer, and it will be interesting to compare the tone of this ending with the tone of the endings in the cat stories, which we'll discuss next time. The final thing that I'm going to leave with you for the Bloody Chamber is some quotes from some critics. Now, as always, just like you do with Shakespeare, you can't just put the critics in there. You have to say, what do they mean? How do they relate to your argument? Why do you agree with them? Why do you disagree with them? Get into a bit of a debate with the critics when you include them in your coursework. Greg Buswell has written a really excellent article that you can access for free on the British Library website. When it comes to this story, he's exploring the symbolism of the Bloody Chamber itself. He offers some different options of what this could symbolise. Could it be the marital bedroom? We know that in many texts, blood is used to symbolise the loss of virginity. He also wonders if it could be some sort of psychological symbol of the womb. The womb, of course, is a site not only of life, but also of death. That's one for you to have a think about. In what ways is the Bloody Chamber a site of life? Another critic named Carrie E. Lockie focuses more on this idea of Carter playing around with the fairy tale genre. Some questions you might want to consider here are, in what ways is this modern? The setting feels very antiquated. What is the relevance of this to our world? What makes this a feminist text? And to what extent is the maiden victorious? Does her shame disqualify her from being fully victorious, or is that part of what she needs to start her new life? And finally, Helen Simpson, who wrote the introduction to your edition of The Bloody Chamber, has written a really wonderful essay. And she talks about how fairy tales are like the sci-fi of the past. And she believes that Carter is using them to explore ideas of how things might be different. Questions there might include, well, what does she want to change? How does she want people's behaviours, and how does she want the relationships between men and women to evolve? That's everything for today. Please remember, go back through this video, find those references, annotate them, add your own ideas, share anything with us in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to Miss Hannah Loves Grammar.